Welcome to the 8th video in our module on the Bible, the greatest story ever told. Chapter 7, the Bible through the years. Presented here is a short chapter, which is a very quick history from the New Testament times all the way through the modern era. Christians in the Roman Empire. In the early days of the church, the Roman Empire controlled most of the Mediterranean region. Life was difficult and dangerous for Christians living within the empire. Despite persecution, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire by 400 AD. The first Christians expected Jesus to return in glory in their lifetimes, but when he had not returned, later generations began the difficult job of building the church for the long term. So we have the early church. During the early centuries of the Christian era, certain bishops and other great Christian teachers produced writings that came to be viewed as authoritative in matters of doctrine that went beyond the scope of the words of Jesus. These authors are known collectively as the Church Fathers. This great era extended from about 100 to 600 AD. Before the Council of Nicaea, many of the writings dealt with the many moral and doctrinal problems faced by the Church. Roman Emperor Constantine in 325 AD called together an ecumenical council at Nicaea to settle disputed religious questions. At the Council of Nicaea, the Fathers stated the official teachings on the relationship of God the Father and God the Son. And after the meeting, Fathers defined the nature of Christ, the structure of the church, and many other Christian doctrines. Soon, differences in church teachings appeared between the Eastern and Western churches that would eventually lead to the schism of 1054 AD. The Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is a statement of faith used in the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and many Protestant churches. According to tradition, it was composed by the 12 apostles, but it actually developed from earlier from baptismal creeds of the earliest church. It reached its final form in the late 6th or early 7th century. Gradually, it replaced other baptismal creeds and was acknowledged as the official statement of faith of the entire Catholic Church in the West. This creed contains a summary of what the early church believed about Christ and what Christians meant by their acts of worship. The statement, "I believe," indicates that Christ was deserving of worship and faith, and that he was on a level with God. This is put in here just to say that this is the church's attempt to summarize the New Testament, particularly, and to say that beyond this, nothing is expected for Christians to believe. This is it. This is the foundational statements. Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the greatest archaeological finds of modern times. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the remains of about 800 to 900 ancient manuscripts found in some 15,000 fragments. They were found in 11 caves along the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Among the scrolls are fragments from nearly all the books of the Hebrew Bible and various writings of an ancient Jewish sect. Most of these manuscripts, meaning handwritten copies, date from the 3rd into the 1st century BC. They have proved invaluable for scholars of biblical texts and of the history of Judaism and Christianity. A young shepherd who is said to have followed a runaway goat into a cave found the first 7 scrolls in 1947. Inside the cave, one of the caves you see before you, inside the cave were several large pottery jars which contained partly decomposed scrolls of leather wrapped in linen cloth. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, explorations of the caves near Qumran turned up pieces of hundreds of other manuscripts, many of them tiny. Many of them writings of that sect, including interpretations of biblical texts, collections of laws, manuals, works on ethics, and texts of worship rites. The scrolls included 2 versions of Isaiah, a commentary on Habakkuk, a collection of songs like the Psalms, and a retelling of the stories in Genesis. Most scholars believe that these scrolls belong to the Jewish sect called the Essenes, the sect that lived an ascetic communal life out in the wilderness. The Septuagint. The Septuagint is the earliest existing Greek translation of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew. The Septuagint was presumably made for the Jewish community in Egypt when Greek was the common language throughout the region. Analysis of the language has established that the first 5 books of the Old Testament were translated near the end of the 3rd century BC, and the rest of the books were translated in the 2nd century BC. So we're going kind of back in time. We're kind of going back, we're in the BCs right now. The name Septuagint, which is from the Latin, which means 70, was derived from the legend that 72 translators, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, who worked independently to translate the whole Bible or the whole Old Testament, and ultimately produced identical versions when they brought them together. But this is far from the truth. The Septuagint is a composite of the work of many translators laboring for well over 100 years. It was made directly from Hebrew originals. In the 3rd century AD, Origen attempted to clear up copyists' errors that had crept into the text of the Septuagint, which by then varied widely from copy to copy. Given that the language of much of the early Christian church was Greek, many early Christians relied on the Septuagint. With the increase of Christian usage of the Septuagint, Jews stopped using the Septuagint altogether. This Greek version, and not the original Hebrew, is what gospel writers used as their reference. So even when our gospel writers were writing and they quote the Old Testament, they didn't quote it in the original language, which was Hebrew. They quoted it in the Greek translation. The Septuagint was not just a different language translation, but it reorganized the order of the books in the Old Testament. It is from this Greek version that we get the Christian reordering of the Old Testament books, divided not into the 3 Jewish sections, but the 4: the law, the history, the poetry, and the prophets. This division has continued in the Western Church in most modern Bible translations. It is in this translation that we received the extra books known to Jews and Protestants as the Apocrypha, and to the Roman Catholics as Deuterocanonical. In Protestant Bibles, the Apocrypha is either omitted or grouped separately, usually between the 2 testaments. The Vulgate. The Vulgate, from the Latin meaning vulgar, which means common. The Vulgate is the Bible in Latin used by the Roman Catholic Church. In the year 382 AD, Pope Damascus commissioned Jerome, a leading biblical scholar of his day, to produce an acceptable Latin version of the Bible from the various translations then being used. He first used the Greek Septuagint, but later decided that this version was unsatisfactory and began translating the entire Old Testament from the original Hebrew versions. He finished his Bible in 45 AD. In the year of 1546, the Council of Trent decreed that the Vulgate was the authoritative biblical translation for the Roman Catholic Church. Jerome's Latin Vulgate became the standard of Christian Christianity, of Western Christianity, for 1,000 years or more. Now we enter some English translations. The first complete English language version of the Bible dates from the year 1382 and was credited to John Wycliffe and his followers. This translation became the object of violent controversy because it was inspired by the heretical teachings of John Wycliffe. His translations, intended for the common man who spoke English, encountered great opposition from the church, who wanted everyone to read Latin. In 1482, a synod of clergy summoned to Oxford forbade the translation and forbade any translation of the scriptures in any other version other than Latin. English scholar William Tyndale believed that every believer should be able to read the Bible in his own language. When he decided to translate the Bible into English himself to make it accessible to all English believers, the church authorities in England prevented him from translating the Bible there. So he went to Germany in 1524, where he completed the New Testament. Tyndale then began working on an Old Testament translation, but was captured before it was completed. He was executed in 1536. The Geneva Bible, also called the Breeches Bible, was a new translation of the Bible published in Geneva. The New Testament in 1557, the Old Testament in 1560, by a colony of Protestant scholars in exile from England who worked under the general direction of Miles Coverdale and John Knox and under the influence of John Calvin. These English churchmen fled London during the oppressive reign of the Roman Catholic Mary I, or Bloody Mary, who had halted the publication of Bibles there. The work acquired the nickname Breeches Bible because it described Adam and Eve as having made breeches to cover their nakedness. After Mary I, Elizabeth I, or Queen Elizabeth, halted persecution of Anglicans and Protestants and allowed Bibles to be printed again. The authorized translation at the time was the Great Bible, named for its large page size and first ordered by Henry VIII in 1538. But the Geneva Bible quickly surpassed this translation in public favor. After Queen Elizabeth I's Protestant reign came King James's Catholic reign. Dissatisfaction with earlier translations made necessary another revision of the Protestant Bible in English. So in 1604, soon after James's coronation as King of England, a conference of churchmen requested that the English Bible be revised again because existing translations were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. King James quickly made the project his own. 47 scholars participated in the translation. They were organized into 6 companies, 2 each working separately at Oxford, Westminster, Oxford, and Cambridge on sections of the Bible assigned to them. The Bible was published in 1611. This is the King James Version, also called the Authorized Version. The translation had a marked influence on English literary style and was generally accepted as the standard English Bible from mid-1600s to early 20th century. Modern translations. As the cost of printing books became a reasonable market in the mid-20th century, and after a rise in linguistical studies, or the study of languages, an explosion of new translations of the Holy Bible became available to the public. To translate words from one language and culture to another is very difficult and not a precise science. Words change meanings over time. In fact, there are many words and phrases used in the Bible of which scholars do not know the precise meanings. Sometimes we can only guess at the meaning. There are 3 general kinds of Bible translations today: word for word, thought for thought, and paraphrase. The word-for-word method of translating is also called literal translation. This is an attempt to keep the exact words and phrases from the original. It is faithful to the original text as far as words printed on a page, but sometimes it is hard to understand because of the historical and cultural distance. The thought-for-thought method of translation is also called dynamic equivalent. This is an attempt to update the writing style and grammar phrase by phrase. This pertains particularly to idioms that made sense to the original ancient readers, but not today. An obscure phrase in the original language is replaced by a modern equivalent that is similar or close in meaning. And a paraphrase is also called free translation. This way of translating takes the ideas from the original text and attempts to update them. It avoids being constrained by the original words or languages, and it seeks to eliminate historical distance. These translations are easy to read, but probably not precise. They seek to catch the essence of the phrases or the passages. So here is an example of the three different approaches to translations. Here's an example of three different approaches to translations. The Hebrew word for anger or wrath is the same word for nose. When God is described as being slow to anger, the Hebrew phrase literally means long-nosed. A word-for-word translation would keep it as long-nosed. A thought-for-thought translation would update it to slow to anger. A paraphrase would say, God does not throw fits of fury. And as you can see on there, a word-for-word translation of John 3:16 would say, may have life, age during. Life, age during. Isn't that strange? Because it's literally translating every single word. Thought for thought would translate it to, shall have eternal or everlasting life. Eternal and everlasting meaning the same thing. Okay, that's updated it for we can understand it. Eternal means age during. Paraphrase would say, have a whole and lasting life. So that is a short history of the Bible, beginning with the Septuagint in Greek, the Vulgate in Latin, and the various English translations throughout the years, including our modern translations, and a little bit about the problem of translation and why we have so many and why some of the translations disagree on some of the nuances of the words.